without further ado, we might get started. I'd like to say hello to everyone and a very warm welcome for everyone joining us from far and wide for this 5th biennial climate lecture, which is of course hosted by the OECD. I'm Mairead Dundas, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session, coming at a critical moment for climate change. 2021, of course, dubbed as the make or break year for action and ambition. This, after 2020 was overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which in the end has offered an unprecedented opportunity in the way of green recovery. Now, our guests today need very little introduction. I think it's fair to say that they have been championing the climate cause for some time now. I have the pleasure of welcoming Angel Gurría, OECD Secretary-General. This is, of course, the Secretary-General's last climate lecture as part of a series that's been running every 2 years since 2013. I'd like to very much welcome you to our session.
Thank you very much, Mairead, and I suppose in Spanish you would go with Mexico, ladies first. So, dear Laurence, dear Nick, dear friends, back in 2013, we launched these biennial lectures to bring attention to the urgency to act on climate change. Now, during past lectures, I stressed the need to move to net zero emissions, then to make coal a thing of the past, in both cases way before its time, so we were not very well received. Then the importance of multilateral action because it was all fragmented. Then activism on climate because we were falling behind. And today we are still on a collision course with nature. As I started to say 15 years ago when I arrived, atmospheric CO2 has increased by 50% since the Industrial Revolution. Around 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Deforestation stands at 10 million hectares per year. The size of ocean dead zones is doubling every decade since the 1960s. And we're seeing greater severity and greater frequency of extreme weather and slow onset events. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the need to change our course even clearer. Habitat destruction, which accounts for 15% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, also contributes to the spread of diseases from animals to people. Now, as I mentioned during my first lecture, I stressed that we needed to reach net zero emissions in the second half of the century. This was controversial then, and now 124 countries have pledged to reach net zero. Thousands of investors have committed to support the transition, not to mention the leadership shown by the youth, by civil society, by every level of government. I also spoke about the tide pulling us towards fossil fuels. And I'm pleased to see that today, more than a quarter of electricity comes from renewables, and this share is projected to increase further. We also see a shift in the transport sector. So all that is progress, all that is good, but we certainly cannot be complacent. We need to move faster, further, together, to implement credible pathways to net zero. Now, the US, China, the UK have already indicated they will significantly increase their mitigation ambition. And well, we are only a few hours away from the summit called by President Biden tomorrow. And I expect that many countries will follow suit. Now, the OECD has been working for decades on environmental, social, economic indicators. We're mainstreaming climate mitigation, and we're mainstreaming climate adaptation across our work, so that it's not a siloed piece of work, but that it just stretches across all of the areas that we touch. Now, we just started a horizontal project on climate and economic resilience. And as part of it, we're starting a new, what we call International Program for Action on Climate, the IPAC, to support countries to implement the goals of the Paris Agreement through a set of climate-related indicators, tailored recommendations, and best practices. This IPAC, by the way, was a French initiative. And we directly support the climate negotiations through the OECD IEA, our sister institution, the International Energy Agency, Climate Change Experts Group, which has been there since the very beginning, since Kyoto. We're also launching this week an expanded version of our Environment at a Glance platform. Again, this is something we've been putting out regularly. Environment at a Glance. It gives access to about 50 climate-related indicators, interactive graphics, key messages on major environmental issues. And of course, we are tracking and supporting the mobilization of finance for climate action. Since 2015, the OECD has measured developed countries' progress towards the famous goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year for climate action in developing countries. Now, we have the numbers, hard number for 2018. They're 28.9, so almost 80 million. We expect that we can get closer, and maybe already we will be at the target by the time we have hard numbers for 2020. But now the problem is not about getting to 100 billion. We must move from the billions to the trillions, as is now almost a cliche. But we must move from the billions to the trillions. And that can only be done with the participation of the private sector. Now, I have been a consistent advocate for putting, this is very scientific, a big fat tax on carbon. Put a big fat tax on carbon. Now, most emissions are currently underpriced. In OECD and in G20 countries, most emissions are priced below 30 euros per ton. And 81% of the emissions are priced below 60 euros per ton of CO2. Now, 60 euros is a level that would have to be reached in 2020 for the world to be broadly on track to deliver on the Paris Agreement. So we are badly off. This gives an idea of how far off track we are. If we don't tax it, if we don't put a price on emissions, we will not be able to change conduct. There's also OECD guidance on green budgeting. This supports governments to align spending with environmental goals. We're also refocusing climate policies through a well-being lens. If it doesn't produce well-being, well, it's not very much worth it. In our 2021 OECD Ministerial Council meeting, this is next month, end of next month, 1st of June, we will report on the development of a dashboard of indicators where it's sort of a GPS, where we monitor progress towards a strong, resilient, green, inclusive recovery. And this week, we released the OECD Green Recovery Databases, tracking the environmental impacts of COVID-19 recovery policies. So how does COVID affect? While hundreds of billions have been allocated, they say about 15 trillion have so far been allocated to fight the pandemic. Only a few hundreds of billions have been allocated to do green type of recovery. But the problem is even more has been channeled to measures that are environmentally negative or mixed. So we're undoing with one hand what we do so strenuously with the other. So dear friends, COVID-19 has changed our world in profound ways. It has also demonstrated how global challenges require global, concerted, multilateral solutions. We have a number of timely and important events coming up. The US Climate Summit, that's tomorrow, the day after. Biodiversity, COP15, COP26, of course, in Glasgow. So let's make the most of them. And remember, our single most important, most urgent intergenerational responsibility is to protect the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angel Gurría. As you just spelled out, significant progress has been made, but in your words, we're still on a collision course with nature. Actions need to be bolder and braver. I'd like to move on now to our next guest for some opening remarks. Joining us, Lord Nicholas Stern, Chair of the Grantham Research Institute. You, in fact, chaired the very first of these climate lectures with Mr. Gurría back in 2013. So it's very fitting to have you join us here for this one now. I'd like to invite you now to share with us some of your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mairead, and it's a real pleasure to be here with Laurence, a friend of many decades, and a special friend also of many decades, Angel Gurría. And at this moment, Angel, I wanted to begin by paying tribute to your extraordinary leadership of the OECD over the last 15 years, in ideas, in analysis, in engagement, in sense of purpose, your great clarity. You've been a wonderful leader these last 15 years, particularly on climate, but not only on climate, on so many other subjects as well. Your impact is already lasting, and we all know, those of us who know you well, that you're going to be doing so much more in this next 15 years, and we look forward to being part of that with you. Now, I want to talk about the two crises, emphasizing particularly the climate, but we are where we are, we start where we are, and we have to drive out of the COVID crisis and the climate crisis and onto a different way of investing, innovating, growing now. This next 2 or 3 years, we'll see the decisions. This decade, we'll see the investments that determine our future. So we have to handle these two crises together. International collaboration has never been more important. This is a moment where we require strong action, where ambition is much less risky than what looks like caution. In this context, diffidence, delay is extremely dangerous. Ambition is less risky. The climate, this decade for the climate, it will be decisive. We know that. We have to cut emissions by something like a half to give ourselves a decent chance of holding to 1.5 degrees. This next 15 or 20 years, the world's infrastructure will roughly double. If that doubling of the infrastructure brings us a new lot of infrastructure, looks anything like the old one, say goodbye to 3 or 4 degrees, let alone 1.5 or keeping well below 2. That's an indication of how decisive this decade will be, because the infrastructure of the next 15 or 20 years will be decided on in this next 5 or 10 years. This is absolutely decisive. In looking at COVID, we have to recognize, particularly for developing countries, that the situation is extremely difficult. They do not yet have the vaccines. We've seen children out of school. We've seen remittances cut, capital flight, denial of access to capital markets. It's going to be particularly difficult for the developing world in these coming few years to come out of the COVID crisis. It will need international collaboration. If we do not get that international collaboration and support coming out of COVID, we will not get the international collaboration we need for climate, and we risk another lost decade for development. So investment and innovation to come out of this crisis is absolutely crucial. We have to increase investment, and it has to be of a very different kind. Investment has collapsed in many parts of the world during the COVID crisis. That has to be restored, but we have to go beyond that. We have to go to something like a 2 percentage point increase in investment around the world to drive on to this new growth path. That's not the cost of moving to tackle climate change, because these investments have fantastic returns in terms of cities where we can move and breathe, in terms of much greater efficiency, in terms of lower cost for electricity, but they have to be made. So this is an enormously attractive proposition, this new growth model, but we have to invest to get it. And we have to get the policies right, and we have to get the expectations right to move on to this new investment path. If we do act strongly, we can tackle the difficulties of this last rather difficult and fragile decade, where we've seen productivity slow down, we've seen social cohesion threatened, we've seen biodiversity threatened, as Angel described so clearly. This last decade's not been a good one, and then we had the COVID crisis on top. With the right kind of investment, we can drive out of this and do things differently, but it needs more investment, and it needs a very different kind of investment. Most investment will be private sector, but a lot at this, particularly in these early years, will need to be public sector. We will get the growth to provide the public revenues. The growth now is the responsible fiscal strategy in this context. Angel was in the Ministry of Finance. I had senior positions in the Ministry of Finance. Fiscal responsibility does matter. It's very important. But growth is the fiscally responsible story now, and an investment-led growth is the fiscally responsible story. So that's the challenge on investment. If we increase investment to 2 percentage points extra above the levels it was of the last decade, we will simply be going back to levels of investment of 10, 15 years ago. This is not impossible. And interest rates have been on the floor. Savings is there to finance the investment. It's not too much saving, it's not enough investment that's been our problem. So that's the challenge. We can see what kinds of investments, we can see the amounts of investments. The challenge now on economic policy and leadership is to get it done. Lots to talk about in policy. My friends in the economics profession, I think, have to step up better than they've done in the past, because this is a challenge of public policy as if time matters. So much of the theoretical analysis of public policy is saying, well, if we changed this kind of policy to change the incentives, then we'd have a new equilibrium, and the new equilibrium would look better than the old equilibrium. And a lot of that story is very useful, but this is deeper than that. This is about how we conduct public policy so that we change very fast, because we have to decarbonize our economies within 30 years, and we have to cut emissions by half in the next decade. Public policy as if time matters. And that's the test. Carbon pricing will be absolutely fundamental. And in Angel's immortal words, which the whole world knows now, a big fat price on carbon. But it's got to be more than that. We're going to need regulation. Think of how quickly we moved out of the incandescent light bulb when we said you can't do that anymore. It's just too wasteful and damaging. Very quickly, we found something else. I think the specification of time limits for the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles will be another one, which will really accelerate public policy as if time matters, not in substitute for a price of carbon. We must have the price of carbon. But alongside that, systems management, systems design in this digital world, cities, energy, transport, land, big complicated systems, but we can manage them much better than we have done in the past with better technology. So this is the story of public policy as if time matters. Many markets are imperfect. Many problems of market failure in research and development, in networks, in capital markets, in information, and of course, the whole story of pollution and biodiversity. We have to act strongly across all those fronts together. But most importantly, are expectations of a clear sense of direction. We're all students of Keynes. Expectations drive investment, and public policy and public action and insistence of the general population help drive investment in good directions. So clarity of goals and being predictably flexible. We're going to learn a lot along the way, and public policy has to be predictably flexible. If we support renewables, then we have to say, as renewables costs come down, as they go out into the economy, then in this way, we can begin to reduce the support for renewables. Predictable flexibility. Central banks do that now. We have to do it across the board in ministries of finance as well. So in conclusion, I've been, like Angel, working on development for half a century. I have never seen a moment where decisive and collaborative action is more important now. There are quadruple wins from collaboration now. The Keynesian recovery, where increasing demand in one country helps another, and we do much better if we do it together. Expectations about rising investment and the direction of investment will help investors much better if those are shared across countries. A lot of the story of driving down costs and creating innovation is about increasing returns to scale. Much better if we set out on these new technologies in many countries together. And of course, climate, biodiversity, so much of pollution are global public goods. We benefit from the action of others. This is a moment where there's quadruple wins to collaboration. This is beyond the story of gains from trade, important though those are, it's still bigger than that. There's never been more important moment to collaborate and be strong. Get it right, and we discover and create a new and much more attractive form of growth and development. Get it wrong, and we have not only a lost decade for development, we leave our children and grandchildren in great danger. This is a moment to decide, and decide together.
Thank you very much for your words there, Lord Nicholas Stern. Innovation and investment, two of the key words coming out of your remarks, which we will be touching on later in our discussion. But I'd now like to invite our third speaker to share her words. It is, of course, Laurence Tubiana, who is often introduced with two hats, that of the architect of the Paris Agreement, as well as now CEO and President of the European Climate Foundation. Pleasure to have you with us. I'd like to now pass over to you, Laurence Tubiana.
Thank you, Mairead. I can say I'm both a little sad and happy to speak at this particular moment of the Angel Gurría career. Under your leadership, Angel, well, OECD has changed totally. If we compare where OECD was before your mandate, the discussion, the analysis, the mindset, well, it's not the same one you are living now. And in particular, because you have said, as you said that before, and I agreeing totally with what Nick Stern said, you have mainstreamed not only climate, but the idea that we could not speak about growth and economy, which was of course and trade, which was of course a key element, the key pillars of OECD reflection, that if we don't have an integrated vision of what development and growth is, so we are talking of something which is not real. And you have made OECD able to re-engineer itself and to understand that sustainable development was the same way that economic development, the same word. It could not be separated. It was really a revolution when you started doing that, Angel. Now it seems just natural, that SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are in a way the horizon and the orientation of should be at least any policy. But you have made that in an institution that was praised by its influence on how economic, fiscal, well, all policies, serious policy making was designed to be. So OECD has been a place where government came to benchmark what they were doing, take advice, and in a way, a very powerful tool to make this concept, this mindset on policy making converge, to try to look for a sort of bottom-up harmonization on monetary policy as well as on tax policy on many issues. And from this power of intellectual influence, and in a way, a broad element of trying to, in a way, improve cooperation through intellectual understanding and very solid analysis, that the qualities, of course, of OECD, you have mainstream sustainable development in that central discussion. And I don't think OECD can go backwards. And that's really your legacy, Angel, to have done that. And you have done that through all the areas of government: trade, innovation, policy, finance, taxation. Such a difficult and sovereign issue, taxation. I will come back to that later. As you said, we need this mainstreaming even more now to remove the barrier we are still facing. And again, the analysis of the situation of the last decade, as you said, Angel, and Nick said as well, good orientation, good movement, but really lagging totally behind what we should be doing. And again, the capacity to remove barriers and reveal the trade-offs that government has to sort it out are really the role that OECD has done very, very well under your leadership. So I think it's OECD now, because of your leadership, is the best practice policy forum, best intellectual contributor to what this economic policy should be. And that's why so many countries want to come in. The club is now with so many demands on many, many continents wanting to come in. That's the price of success. But as you, I am concerned about, if I may say so, the modesty really of the efforts to really make the recovery green. As you said, trillions and trillions invested, in particular in developed countries, in particular, of course, in OECD members, to tackle the COVID crisis and the economic and social crisis coming along with it. And still, the few percent which from this recovery are green are really very, very few percent. When we know, as Nixon has said, and you said very clearly, the next decade, the actual decade, not the next one, the actual decade is a decisive one. So we could not postpone action. And I am afraid, even if the next summit, in particular the G7 and the G20, where OECD will play its role, its traditional role of really inspiring policies, that this summit has to take the discussion much more seriously. We can just be happy with this very few percent on green investment in the recovery. And I sincerely hope that climate will not take a backseat in this discussion. Of course, you led with OECD the charge on carbon pricing, and certainly it's, of course, a very important area of convincing governments, private sector, that it is an essential tool. But as we need to reach zero emission of greenhouse gases very, very quickly now. So we need all the instruments, but in a way, gathered around this target to deliver this in time. When I remember the first attempt many, many years ago, in the first contribution, important economic contribution that Lord Nixon has led, we were so many years ago. And at that time, the carbon price could be absolutely the essential route in many ways. And remember, we had the Kyoto Protocol, who was in 1997, putting carbon price at the center. But we have been delayed action too much. And now we need every effort, every policy to be climate friendly, to be climate supportive, to mainstream all the elements from, of course, the taxing on carbon, on the regulation, on the fiscal policy, on the tax policy in general. So everything has to be consistent with the goal we have decided to follow, that's the Paris Agreement goals. So we don't have time to do the price discovery. We need to roll out zero emission technology immediately and practices. And we have the most effective portfolio of policies to do so. And it's time, in a way, to treat CO2 and other greenhouse gases, methane in particular, and the others, as really quasi-toxic. We have to fight like we are fighting the pandemic, a toxic virus. We have to really treat CO2 and greenhouse gases as toxic as a virus. And that's why we need very strong regulation, as we need very strong investment directed to this green infrastructure. Angel, under your leadership, you began to change the mindset of policymakers. I do think now you have to change the mindset, and you would do that after, I'm sure. And the institution you are living has to pursue this objective of changing the mindset of macro policies. Still now, we have a thinking in the macroeconomic academia and the treasuries who are leading these macro policies that are not linked to the climate emergency. Investment, the multiplier investment, the integration of climate in what should be the stability, the financial stability, is still not there. And I think we need this intellectual revolution in the way we conduct macro policy. So now we have more and more very good sectoral policies. We understand investment. We understand that taxation should really mainstream climate, but still we are lacking the global perspective, in particular in a moment where still we have very low interest rate. We need this investment. We need that this investment that are really has to be really unfold to support the solution of the crisis. They have to be green. They cannot be something else. It's not to have some green in the infrastructure of transport, of city planning, on energy, on agriculture. They have to be green, that's it. So period. So the same on the financial system. You have been an advocate of really transparency and reorienting the financial system to green investment, and for that, transparency effort were very good. But now we have to, in a way, go further and go for really a real accountability. We have to see the numbers very simply. As you said, for the moment, the financial system is talking about green and mainstreaming climate, but at the same time, the percentage, both on the public investment and the private capital going to green is really, really still too small. So we have to make the shift, and make the shift from commitments, which are good and essential because we have to change expectation, to reality. I'd like finally to say that you, in your role, you have done, I think, a very important influence. You have exerted a very influence that you could absolutely have sovereignty. OECD is about nation state as sovereign on their decision on the policy making, but they need cooperation and they need harmonization and convergence if you want to multiply the benefits of these policies. And of course, evident in the monetary policy, evident certainly in trade, evident even more now on climate related policies. And we are in a moment where cooperation and conflict are side by side. Europe with its Green Deal, US with a new administration, China, all are in a way competitors, good competitors for climate leadership, and that's good. But at the same time, they may not understand that these can go along with convergence and harmonization in the policies. This very important message, Angel, you gave all along your mandate at OECD should be renewed and even more assertive. Even if there is a good competition for climate leadership, this comes with harmonization and convergence if we want to maximize the benefit of all these policies. So competition with cooperation is not competition with conflict. And I would like to take that as a main message you have been given. Cooperation and competition with the direction of the Sustainable Development Goals is really the message you have been given, Angel. I sincerely hope that this will be the continuous line of OECD intellectual influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence Tubiana. Of course, touching there on the shortfall of commitments to the environment and climate in the COVID stimulus package is a point that we had heard earlier. Also, interestingly, treat CO2 as a toxic virus, something to keep in mind. I'd just like to remind our audience now that it is possible to send through questions to any of your guests after what you've heard, simply by using the Zoom chat function. And we will come back for 2 or 3 perhaps at the end when we've got time. Right now, we're going to move on to a discussion between myself and the speakers. And I wanted to look forward, but not too far forward, because at the end of the year, we've got politicians, scientists, activists, business leaders convening in Glasgow for COP26. Angel Gurría, for you, what does a successful COP26 look like?
Well, it's critical to make the most of these upcoming international events on climate, on biodiversity, deserts, and the oceans, of course, but including COP26, very importantly, COP26, to make sure they lead to concrete action. We need to see increased ambition, as Nick Stern mentioned a moment ago, combined with the development of credible paths, practical paths towards net zero emissions. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees implies reaching net zero emissions globally at the latest by 2050, ideally before. However, current pledges show that the world is not on track to avoid global warming that is going to be above. Now, I don't want to go to 3 or 4, but certainly 1.5 is not in the books, is not in the on the signals today the way we're going. So the OECD is supporting the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and of course I mentioned the IPAC, the OECD, IA, climate change experts group, etc. But we need to do more. We need to do better commitments, and this is why I'm also putting a lot of hope on the meeting that was convocated by President Biden tomorrow and the day after, because I think that this can get the best out of the countries to say, okay, if we're all going to be ambitious, we can do it. We can make it as long as we are together, and that the bigger countries, the bigger emitters, of course, are playing ball. This is crucial to get everybody then to play ball just the same, and this requires mobilization of public finance, enhanced efforts to ensure that private finance is aligned to the needs of net zero transitions. It also, we need the private sector to mobilize the trillions, but they also need some policy recommendation in terms of how they should. And we also need to see significantly enhanced action on climate change adaptation, including greater support for developing countries. Again, maybe if we get to the 100 billion, and we very well may get there, the problem is how to move now to a much larger amount. So we're contributing to these areas. We have this task force on climate change adaptation. We have work on nature-based solutions, which supports countries to scale up these nature-based solutions to tackle climate change, but also to tackle the question of biodiversity. Preserving, restoring natural storm surge protection. Just an example. Coral reefs, coastal wetlands, that can protect 35% of the people who are exposed to coastal flooding globally. I mean, just, one focus, one area. So I just want to mention this because focusing on these specific areas and the specific subjects can have very, very dramatic results and can benefit millions and millions of people across the world.
Thank you. Laurence Tubiana, given your experience engineering the success of COP21, what are some of the challenges that could hold up progress at this particular COP event?
We are at a moment of truth for the Paris Agreement. 5 years ago, we shaped expectation. We have much clearer goals, which are to be net zero globally by the mid-century. We had a whole system of mechanism for all government, which was the first time to present their climate plans and really reduce emission everywhere. So now, and of course, Paris Agreement was in 2020, now 2021, because of the COVID crisis. The countries has to come with climate plans that are consistent with this long-term net zero by 2050 or soon after. And that's a moment of truth because, again, initially the governments in 2015, that was the first time, they present, without knowing exactly what the framework will be, contributions that were well below the goal, consistent with the goal of Paris, like limited temperature to well below 2 degrees C and hopefully maintain temperature rise to 1.5 degree compared to pre-industrial levels. And now, now we have to, in a way, to do the accounts and see how much countries really are increasing their efforts. We have good signs, but still has to be precise. Good signs on the European side, with this 55%, good sign of emission reduction by 2030, good sign by China, but still, of course, maybe waiting for a new announcement during the 22nd of April summit. US, of course, we are waiting for the numbers and the policies, but we see that at least it is seriously taken at the highest level. But again, commitments are commitments. And the reality for the moment is not there of the emission reduction. And that, so ambition on the contribution is really being truthful to what countries sign up in 2050. But we need now accountability. And maybe that's the progress that can be made in Glasgow. That could, in a way, make government, but as well the private sector, the businesses, the cities, all this movement of actors that have been, in a way, energized by the Paris Agreement and still very, very active, has an horizon for everybody, financial institution, for example, the multilateral development banks, the private financial institution as well. We need them to recognize that, cooperation comes when you trust people, when you trust countries, when you trust government, when you trust each other. And that trust has to be built in Glasgow in a much more solid way, that we need the accountability, the capacity to show that it's not only one moving ahead, it's not only one country, it's everybody. So accountability for me, meaning the trust factor that has in a way disappeared during the last 5 years because of the Trump administration, because of, in a way, too slow action. We need to restore that or to construct a trust framework. And I think that would be for me a very, very big element of Glasgow's success. And then we need the solidarity element. In a way, to have a success, you can't operate in vacuum. We need a success in the vaccine rollout everywhere to get a good success in Glasgow or in Kunming or everywhere, every time when solidarity and cooperation has to be, is part of the discussion. So this is a first step. We cannot leave Africa out of the vaccine rollout, and with not tackling the debt, which is not only the African debt, by the way, Latin American debt and crisis is very, very heavy as well. And then we need the solidarity, the financial package that is still for the moment lacking. We see, hopefully, many people working for that. But that's why I would say the obstacle will be not enough ambition, not enough reality of this commitment, meaning the accountability element, the trust element, and then not enough solidarity. If we have these three, we will have a totally different departure. Again, and the fact that, yes, Paris Agreement is not only something we commit to, but we are implementing it.
And we talk a lot about COVID-19 because COVID-19 and climate change right now are two crises, as Nicholas Stern said earlier, that we need to consider together right now. Health pandemic, in fact, triggered the largest drop in emissions since the Second World War. But just this week, the International Energy Agency warned that energy-related CO2 emissions are set to rise by 5% this coming year, the biggest annual rise since 2010 in the wake of the financial crisis. Nicholas Stern, how do you reboot the economy quickly without diverting efforts and investment away from climate change?
I think you have to recognize that we must drive out of this world recession associated with COVID by increased investment of the right kind. And it's that which will give you lasting employment. Investing in fossil fuel related recovery leads you to stranded assets and stranded jobs. It's a very serious mistake to do that. So in this recovery, we have to recognize that if we want a strong recovery, a sustained recovery, we need much less coal and not more coal, and similarly with the other fossil fuels. So I think the crucial issue that we have to set out, and which has to be understood, is that increased investment, we must drive out of this through investment, but it must be of the right kind if this is to be a sustained recovery. And if we do, then we have the growth and development story of the 21st century in our hands, right across all the issues of well-being that the OECD under Angel have emphasized so strongly. Health, job opportunities, social cohesion, environment and biodiversity, all of those issues which we have to tackle together will be taken forward by strong investment of the right kind. And of course, you need the policies and the expectations to drive that investment, and you need the finance. We haven't discussed that in detail, but you need the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. You need the management of risk, you need development banks, you need the changing structure for private sector finance, and of course through the public exchequer as well. A very big subject, very important. But the answer to this is investment of the right kind to drive us forward down a new path, which will not simply be a path of recovery in the short term. It will be a much stronger, robust recovery right through this decade and beyond.
Thank you. I wanted to move on to Angel Gurría, because the OECD plays an important role in the international arena as a knowledge hub, particularly focused on sustainability and climate change. In parallel with the UN process we've just discussed, what are some of the tools that the OECD can offer economies to help move closer to this climate neutrality goal? As Laurence mentioned, it's all well and good to have the ambition, but we need the pathway to get there as well.
Well, first of all, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. I think we're offering an annual climate action monitor. That means, you know, where are we? Are we on the right track? As sort of a GPS, as I mentioned. Are we on the right track? Do we have to go faster? Do we have to go? Right now, the conclusion is very clear. We have to go faster. We're lagging behind. And as the IA just put out, as you mentioned, you know, there is this recovery of the emissions, which is, you know, we're going backwards. There's also climate-related indicators, so that people can simply, you know, just quote the indicators and say, why is it that you are behind and that people cannot deny it? And that you just can say, you have a ranking which is based on indicators and based on reality rather than on perceptions. Then country notes, that means because in the end, countries are driving the result. The combined result is going to be driven by countries. There's no amount of international agreements, et cetera, that can drive a country if the country doesn't drive itself to get it right. As I said, we're so encouraged by the fact that this summit is being called tomorrow and the day after, but also that John Kerry chose to go to China to get China in a moment when there are many tensions with China, et cetera. But he chose to go to China because on this, China is the indispensable partner of the United States in order to reach the proper results of the Paris Agreement. So it's encouraging to see that also because other countries have already announced, and then an interactive platform for dialogue so that people can easily see what's going on. We've had since Kyoto, as I said, we have this climate change expert group with the IEA, which are looking at all the technical issues. But let me just mention what Nick said a moment ago: finance, 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 because public finance is going to get to the 100 billion, but only private finance is going to get to the trillions. And then the question of disclosure, for example, on which there's been considerable progress, but there must be more disclosure. A number of investment banks, investment funds, hedge funds, et cetera, are now saying, I will not support companies or projects that are coal-based, for example. This is very encouraging, and we should just make it like the rule, that coal-based projects are no longer financed, that export credit no longer support coal-based projects of any kind. There's no such thing as clean coal or dirty coal. There's just, dirty coal and dirtier coal, so we should stop financing them. Now, this is crucial because we have to create the incentives for the private sector to come and invest. It has to be in a framework where, well, basically because otherwise there will be costs attached. But the other hand is because it's a good business, because you do it because you're convinced that it's going to produce a good dividend for your shareholders, but also the fact that you have no choice because it's the only way to go. So you have to go regulations and proper market incentives, plus what I think we've gained is a greater level of awareness.
Thank you very much. Earlier we heard you say, Angel, we had the pleasure of hearing you say, Angel Gurría, that we need to put a big fat price on carbon. Nicholas Stern, you have been a long-term champion of carbon pricing. I wanted to ask you how you feel the landscape has evolved since your report in 2017, more or less appetite. Is it the only solution? I want to add a question that's just come through from one of the audience members. What should the cost of carbon be? What price should be on carbon right now?
Thank you, Mairead. Let me take that last part of the question first. Joe Stiglitz and I, working about 5 years ago and working in relation to well below 2 degrees for the Paris Agreement, suggested for 2020, $40 to $80 a ton, and for 2030, $50 to $100 a ton. I think we should be clear now that we need the high end of those ranges, because we've been slow since we worked on that 5 years ago. We've increased the ambition, rightly so, to 1.5 degrees, and we've deepened our understanding of the grave dangers of climate change. So I would now suggest close to the top of those ranges, $60 to $80 a ton now, and at least $100 a ton for 2030. And that's based on the question, what kind of carbon price do we need to give the incentives to get where we need to go? That's the question that we were trying to answer. But in the context of other policies, like standards, a fixed date for stopping the sale of the internal combustion engine, standards for home heating. The whole land use story and food, of course, is extremely important in this context as well. So we're going to need other policies around standards and regulation. We're going to have to invest, particularly in the digital management of systems like energy, transport, land, cities, and so on. That'll be a big part of the story. And we've got to invest strongly in R&D, and we've got to organize the finance, as Angel was emphasizing, to help manage the risk involved in the strong increase in investments of the right kind. Always remembering that not doing those investments or doing dirty investments is much more risky than doing the investments we're describing, but still you need to manage the financial and other risk in those investments. For that, financial structures will be important. So it's what Laurence said, it's got to be everywhere. It's got to be everywhere, but the big fat price of carbon is absolutely crucial. It won't be on its own, it can't be on its own, but it must be there.
Laurence Tubiana, COVID-19 showed us many things, one of them being how vulnerable we are. It also reminded us that the health of people, animals, and the environment are often inextricably linked. How can we achieve an integrated approach to climate change, COVID-19, biodiversity at the one time?
I think there are two levels of response to that. One, we still have to get better science. Science has been the key factor of our understanding of all these global threats, both in health, in biodiversity, in climate. But still the science linking all these elements is there, but not fully integrated. So we need an additional scientific developments that we can really understand the mechanism through which biodiversity and climate interact. We have some ideas, but still the scientific community is still working in a little bit in silos, and there is actually efforts to try to bring all this. So we need a scientific assessment, and some of the scientific groups are trying through the planetary boundaries, for example, or integrating through, for example, this question that Angel Gurría raised on the nature-based solution. It's a beginning of understanding, and in particular, mentioning coral reef and adaptation, the way that biodiversity can help solve climate issues and how much the climate is a major threat factor together with the human activities. So we need much more science. But the second element is that when you look at any government of any even sophisticated, administratively well-run country, people are not working together. You can see that the preparation, for example, of the next phase of the recovery plans that all countries are submitting, for example, to the European Commission, you don't see that integration there. You don't see that the solution to the health are linked to the solution to climate, and I would even mention biodiversity. So I think our governance structure are for the moment unable to think in this integrated way. So we need intellectual effort, and we need organization in the government that, in a way, when I was saying climate has to be part of the whole policies, and when you look, by the way, at the Biden administration, you see how much he has put climate in many, many areas of government. So we need, in a way, to have these global threads, this One Health approach in the government structure. I think that's very necessary. And again, when you take all the actors to have their mainstream in the strategy, for example, asking companies to report on the extra financial element on all these three, how was it doing for all these SDGs requirements? It's an intellectual revolution because people know how to do the things like normal. look at the macroeconomic indicators, look at the, in a way, the benefit, the profit and the margin for one company on a quarter basis. Everybody knows how to do that, but we need much more powerful intellection on how now the policy making, the economic strategy of companies has to be transformed. So that's why we think a new effort of OECD to change the mindset. I think it's basically a change of mindset, Mairead. But we need new measurement. We need new measurement. If not, we cannot do it.
Thank you very much. I've got a question now that's directed to Angel Gurría from the audience. Particularly relevant given that you're coming to the end of your term at the OECD. And this is someone asking, what's the role of young people in the fight against climate change, and how can their voices be taken into account, especially within COP26?
Well, first of all, raise your voice. Go out. Make your message loud and clear. Use as many of the tools that you can. And today, you have the most powerful tool, which is communications are in your hands. They're in your palm. And therefore, just make it very, very clear. Send out the message. You know, we used to say many decades ago, write to your congressman. Well, here, you don't have to write to your congressman. You can go directly to the leaders and let them know. I think it helps to be organized, but you don't necessarily have to wait for everybody to be organized. Send out the message. And also because leaders want this, they need this, they appreciate it. They also need to know that they're doing the right thing, because there will be costs to their decisions and to their policies. There will be some groups that are affected, and they will raise their voices very loudly because they are powerful and they have a lot of means, and they're very close to the media, etc. So basically, we need to be louder, we need to be stronger, and we need to be more consistent, and we need to show that we are many, many, many more, that we are millions and millions and millions. Because when you're talking about coastal wetlands, and when you're talking about coral reefs, and when you're talking about the mangroves, and you're talking about the air and the soil and the water, the different bodies of water, when you're talking about the ocean, how is it that we're not so angry because we're saying now, we've gotten used to saying that in 2050 there will be more plastic by weight than fish in the ocean, and now we take it as a given rather than rebel against it. So I would say we are at an inflection point, and this is, we always say we're an inflection point on anything, you know, but right now we either make or break. You know, we either going to make it. This, as Nick Stern said, this is the decade in which the Paris Agreement is going to be tested. The genius of Laurent Fabius and Laurence Tubiana and the team that was assembled there, and all of us who who helped one way or another, I think, was to provide options and time. But now the 5-year planning period, the 5-year startup period has now finished, has now ended, and now we go further, and we either, as I said, we make or break. So I would say to the young people, go out there. It's about you. This is, as I said before, the most important intergenerational responsibility. It's us in our, responsibility to them. So we would say, demand from us that we deliver.
Thank you. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to offer a quick 30 seconds each to Lord Nicholas Stern and Laurence Tubiana. We've obviously got the US summit tomorrow, an important moment after an absence of the US in the climate talks. In just 30 seconds, I'll start with Nicholas first. Is this the best chance we've got? Is it now or never?
It's absolutely now, and there's no excuse for delay. We have in our hands a new way of advancing, growing, developing, raising living standards in the deep meaning of living standards. It's going to need investment, and it's going to need strong leadership internationally. Investment, international collaboration, leadership. Now is the time for leaders to lead, and I'm totally with Angel Gurría. The young people of the world are our hope. I teach in a university, I get older, they stay the same age. This generation understands this. They understand the science, they understand the consequences of what we're doing, and they see the hope in doing things differently. So please speak up, the young people of the world. You are, keep going, and you will press us to do the right thing.
Laurence Tubiana, now or never, is this the moment since COP 2021 in Paris? I'll just get you to unmute. Hang on one. I'll just get you to unmute. Thanks, Laurence.
It's a moment of truth. Exactly. It's now. It's a moment of truth. It's never now and never, because, we will have to do that again and again. Each degrees count. Each emission reduction counts. So now, because the leaders have to really be true to what they say about importance of climate, it's a moment for societies, because it's a whole encompassing effort of society and demand from the society. It cannot be done from top. It has to be coming from the necessity of transformation for the whole society. But then it's a route. It's not a moment in history. It's a pathway. It's an effort that would continue, in particular in this next 10 years, but as a deep transformation, we have to go along until the full transformation of our economic system. So it's now, but it's not never. It's just all along the pathway we have to walk again for many, many years ahead of us.
It's for always. Thank you very much. It's almost time to bring this 5th OECD Climate Lecture to a close. In case you want to listen again to any of the points made, the entire conversation will be added to the Climate Lecture webpage of the OECD shortly. But before we wrap up, I'd like to offer the final remarks to the OECD Secretary-General Angel Gurría.
Listen, just to say it's been a privilege, it's been a pleasure, and it's been fun also, to join the lectern with these fantastic colleagues. We have been fighting for many decades, and we will continue to fight for many decades, because the challenge never ends. I think perhaps let's reflect on the fact that we got so excited and so happy so satisfied with the results of 2015, and that perhaps we lower our guard. And then we saw so many countries confirm, and then we saw so many countries go with their NDCs, etc. Now we realize that since then, we were still not at the target. And therefore, the question of being more ambitious now is not an option, because it's a correction of the route. It's a correction of the roadmap that we should have gotten, but that was not politically possible at that time in 2015. Now in 2020, in 2021, as Laurence said, the science, as Nick said, the science, the economics, the finance, and then the social impact is very clear. We know more. We have less doubts. We just had the breakup of the largest glacier in the world. This happened yesterday. So this should be very, very important incentives to move forward. Thank you very, very much. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you, Mairead, for your moderation and for keeping us more or less on the straight and narrow.
Thank you very much, everyone. Well done.